This is episode number 7 with Dr. Loretta Breuning.
And that's why each of us gets wired by our unique individual life experience. And when I say wired, it's not the words you use when you intellectualize about your beliefs, but it's the pathways to your neurochemicals that either tell you this is going to be good or this is going to be bad.
What's up? Welcome back to another episode of Anchors of Health. I'm your host, Bill Choi of anchorsofhealth.com. And today's episode is under the mindset anchor, but it's from a perspective that we haven't heard before on this show. My guest, Loretta Breuning, PhD, explains how happiness and the ups and downs in our life come from brain chemicals. And by understanding how these brain chemicals work, we're able to better manage how we feel on a day-to-day basis. Now, a lot of her research and study behind her work came from observing mammals who have similar brain chemicals as humans. So it's an interesting perspective. She talks about the 4 happy chemicals, how they turn on and exercise strategies for each one, why the brain always compares, how our brain wires itself, how to create new habits, and so much more. She's the founder of the Inner Mammal Institute and professor of management at California State University, East Bay. It's a fascinating interview. I had a lot of fun doing this one. So without further ado, here's Dr. Loretta Breuning. Dr. Loretta Breuning, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on the show today because I've been looking into your work for like 2 weeks straight now. I read a bunch of your stuff on your website, your blog post on Psychology Today, as well as your 2 books, Habits of a Happy Brain and The Science of Positivity, which were fantastic, by the way. Thank you for writing them.
Thanks so much for reading them.
Before we get into your 2 books, I want to back up and get into your personal story and journey of what made you look into this area in the way that you did. So let's start from the beginning. I read that you were born in Brooklyn, you moved to the suburbs before you could talk, and you grew up around a lot of conflict and struggled to make sense of it. Can you talk about what this conflict was in various stages of your life, starting from when you were a kid?
In every stage, it was always my mother. And I know that a lot of people have those kind of feelings, and a lot of young people feel that their mother is crazy. And that's why I don't use those kind of labels, or any kind of labels. But my mother had a terrible life experience before I was born, and she saw the world through a terrible lens, and her unhappy chemicals were being triggered all the time, and she struggled to explain why, and she blamed me for her unhappiness. And so that left the ball with me. I'm like, why are people so unhappy? Because I knew that I wasn't causing her unhappiness. So I guess that's what always motivated me to figure out, what causes humans' ups and downs.
Very interesting. And at the core of your 2 books, you emphasize the importance of understanding how our brain chemicals work. The 4 happy chemicals you mentioned are dopamine, endorphin, oxytocin, and serotonin, which each trigger a different good feeling, but it's complicated, as you say. So we need to appreciate and understand that there's also cortisol, myelin, mirror neurons, and habituation. So can we dive into some of these, starting with the 4 happy chemicals? What is dopamine and how does it turn on and off?
Sure. First, I really appreciate you for being so organized. And I just want to mention to listeners that if this sounds like a lot of information, everything he just said is on my homepage in a very, very short form. So you can only digest it in little bits if you want. So dopamine is the more everyday word would be joy or excitement. But in fact, it's released by the brain we've inherited for a very specific reason, is when you expect to get a reward. So in the human world, the most famous example would be, I see the finish line in a marathon. But in the animal world, where these chemicals and this brain control mechanism was inherited from, imagine that I'm a monkey and I'm hungry and I see a fruit at the far end of a tree and I have to climb to get it, and maybe there's some danger along the way, and I finally am just about to grab that fruit. So that's a great natural example of dopamine.
And I love that landmark research study with monkeys and spinach leaves. Can you talk about that one?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, this explains why dopamine leads to frustration in everyone. So we don't have to feel like something is wrong with us or something wrong with the world. Dopamine frustrates us because our brain is constantly habituating to what we already have. So in this experiment, some monkeys were trained to do a task, and they were given a spinach leaf in payment for that task. And then suddenly the experimenters gave them a sugary treat rather than spinach. And that surges your dopamine because in the state of nature, you're always looking for food, and sugar is a bigger find, a bigger score of food. So dopamine connects neurons that tell your brain, this is it, this is the way to go. So those monkeys were searching with dopamine when they got the unexpected reward for their task. And for about 4 days, every day, the same thing, they got the sugary treat, they had the dopamine, and then after a few days, their dopamine stopped. So they were still getting the same sugar, but their brain stopped reacting to it because, hey, I take it for granted. Why get excited about something I already have? So it's only when it's new information that your brain releases dopamine, because that's what you need to say, this is the way to go. If you already know the way to go, so it's only a new reward. So if you get a bonus that's 10% bigger every year, then after a while, it's like it doesn't even feel like a bonus. Then it has to be 20% bigger to trigger your dopamine. So in this experiment, the researchers stopped giving the sugary treat and went back to giving the spinach leaf. And the monkeys went into a rage and threw the spinach back at the researchers, which is exactly how you would feel if your boss, instead of giving you a 10% increase in your bonus, you got only a 5%. So that's why we are so easily frustrated, and why, we'll work for dopamine. That's what our brain is designed to do, is to work for dopamine.
So as I was reading this in your book, I was thinking of my 3-year-old daughter who loves to go to grandma and grandpa's house. We don't go often, but when I tell her we're going to go, she just surges with excitement. That's dopamine, right?
Yes, and it makes us, of course, wonder what is the reward that she's getting from your parents or her grandparents.
Well, we live in New York City here in a small, tiny apartment. So when we go to New Jersey, they live in a big house, and she loves to run around the kitchen. Okay, great. So, and of course, you'll easily see as her brain grows that running around the kitchen won't do it for her anymore, but then she'll look for another reward and another, and that's the power of dopamine. Right. So it's like our brain is always comparing rewards to expectations, right?
Exactly. Very good. And expectations, it's important to know, are real physical things. They're connections between neurons. And if we have any brain geeks there, I know they're not physically connected. There's a synapse, but there's physical changes at the synapse that cause you to have expectations because your electricity flows through the pathways that are already developed. And that says, if I do this, I'll get more good feelings. But we all know that the world is not perfectly predictable. And so you don't always get the good feelings when you take the step that worked before.
And in your book, you give us some exercises or healthy habits that we can do to turn on dopamine. So can you share some of those examples?
Sure. So the simplest one is to divide your goals into small steps. So, for example, a person who says, I want to sing in Carnegie Hall, is going to be frustrated for years. And if they continue, probably they won't continue, but if they do continue, and if they did sing in Carnegie Hall, they'd get a lot of dopamine at once, which would be sort of like taking cocaine. And then the rest of their life would be like coming off cocaine. So instead, if you want like a nice, happy life, just divide your steps, like each thing you want to do towards your goal, to divide it into a step, and then to celebrate when you've achieved that step, instead of going to bed every night telling yourself, I could have done more. The other thing I tell people is to have multiple goals, because often your progress on your goals is blocked in some way that feels out of control, and then your whole life feels out of control. But if you have a short-run goal, a long-run goal, and a medium goal, then you can constantly shift to work on whatever goal has room at that moment.
Right. Those are great examples. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is endorphin. How is this triggered?
Very good question. So endorphin is triggered by real physical pain, which is why we hear in the context of runner's high that people say they get an endorphin high, but it's only when they run to the point of pain. They don't get it every day. And I absolutely do not advocate inflicting pain on ourselves in order to get endorphin. So I am not advocating trying to trigger it, except you get a little bit from laughing. And so that's the one that I advocate.
Yeah, and as I was reading about this one, I remember when I was in elementary school in recess, I jumped over some kid and he stuck out his leg and I injured my ankle really badly. I ended up walking home after that. And when I got home, I took off my socks and it was all swollen. Later, I found out that my ankle was actually broken and my mom was shocked that I was able to walk home. So that was probably endorphin, right?
Oh, very good example. So this is what I tell people, like when you trip and somebody says, "Are you okay?" You can't know because for 15 minutes, endorphin masks pain. And all of these evolved for a purpose. So in this case, imagine your caveman ancestor broke his leg, but has to go for help or escape from a tiger before he can nurse his wounds. And that's what endorphin evolved for. And to be a little more graphic, when you see the lion chasing the gazelle, and the gazelle is wounded, and the gazelle has 15 minutes of endorphin to either escape and protect its injuries or die in peace. And that's how nature works.
Interesting. And some strategies that people can use. You mentioned crying. I guess that's kind of difficult on occasion. But also you mentioned laughing as well, right? That's another strategy that people can use.
Yes. Endorphin, I say in the book, is triggered by crying, but I'm not advocating crying. But if you do cry, to just tell yourself that you're accomplishing something. And laughing is very valuable, but people don't always, you can't force it, you can't always predict it, but you can create the circumstances for it. And so one is to allocate time. Instead of always saying I'm too busy to do X, Y, and Z, to say I'm getting something important done when I'm giving myself time for an activity that would make me laugh. The other is, and this has happened to me a lot, friends invite me to something that they think is funny, and I don't think it's funny at all. And then I invite my friends to things I think is funny, and they don't think it's funny at all. So I've just given up and said, I think my own laughs are more important, so I'm going to do what I think is funny instead of just trying to do that herd thing, which is the next chemical we'll talk about, right?
Right. And before we get there, I just want to highlight that you also had exercise differently and stretching as well, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. So stretching relieves, triggers some endorphin, which is good, and just getting up as often as possible. So if you overstretch, of course, you know that that's bad. So something that's good a little bit doesn't mean that a lot is going to give you like a huge endorphin high. So we can just trigger a lot of the small ones often. So for example, I can, like right now as we're speaking, I'm rolling my feet and stretching my ankles, right? Exercise differently is a great one. And of course, CrossFit is the shining example. Well, although they also work to the point of pain, which I don't advocate. But the bottom line is that if you keep repeating the same activity, you keep using the same muscles. But if you do a variety of activities, you trigger a variety of muscles, and then you get those small endorphin reliefs more regularly, more often.
Those are all great examples. And speaking of stretching, we just had Kit Lachlan on episode 5, so go check that out if you missed it. The next is oxytocin. How is this turned on?
Okay, oxytocin is often called the love hormone, but it's much more complicated. So the general term is trust. Oxytocin triggers the feeling of trust, whether I trust you or you trust me. Now, there's a natural urge for social support in the animal world, and social support protects an animal from being eaten by a wolf in the sense that if you're in the center of the herd, you're less likely to get eaten, whereas if you wander off on your own, your genes are going to be eliminated. So natural selection built a brain that rewards us with a good feeling when we stick to safety in numbers. Now, we humans don't like to feel like we're herd animals, but we call it attachment. So oxytocin is, for those of you with any medical background, is related to childbirth and lactation. So this means every one of us has started our life with a surge of oxytocin, and parents get oxytocin to bond to their babies. But the natural process is that our attachment transfers from our parents to our herd. And in the animal world, this is how animals get to survive when their parents are no longer there. In the human world, it explains the kind of behavior we associate with high school or junior high, that sort of gang behavior, herd behavior, crowd behavior. But it's a very real part of our brain, because each time your oxytocin flows, you build pathways, and then you expect to get more good feeling when you have social support, and you feel threatened when you distance from social support.
So I think a lot of us have gotten our trust broken sometime in our life, which can be a very sensitive area. What should people be aware of when it comes to this?
Very good question. I really appreciate how not only you figured it all out, but you're asking it all in such a logical way. So this is the thing, that your brain is always building pathways from past experience. So if you have a good experience with someone, you let them close to you, and now they're close enough to hurt you. And in the animal world, animals literally bite each other, or much worse. And so animals only let another individual close to them if they trust them. And then once someone bites you, then that's an emergency from your brain's perspective. So you release a lot of cortisol, the stress chemical, and that builds a really big circuit that says, whoa, don't let this one close to me. So we're trying to override the good feeling with the bad feeling in order to protect ourselves from potential threats. And on the one hand, people suffer from overdoing this, but on the other hand, trusting everyone is not safe. So our brain evolved to help us steer away from trusting when it's not safe.
Great explanation. So what are some ways that people can turn on oxytocin?
Good question. So I recommend trust in small steps. Build small steps, small bridges, small stepping stones. And I have to say that I got this idea from a funny place, which is divorce lawyers who deal with very disgusting, offensive cases.
I bet.
And when it's hard to trust, the more of a sense of betrayal there is, the harder each step is. But it's important to note that each time you have a small act of trust that turns out well, you can think of it as a small release of happy chemicals that connects some small neurons. And if you keep repeating those small steps, then you build a bigger and bigger circuit that makes it possible for you to trust in a specific circumstance that was harder to trust before. So again, I'm not saying that you should just have this, well, I'm going to trust everybody and let everybody get close enough to bite me, and then if they bite me, I'll just let them bite me again. This is not healthy, and if you try to do that, your mammal brain will not be happy with you. So this is an alternative.
Yeah, trust is a tough one. Now, let's move on to the fourth one here. What is serotonin and how is this stimulated?
So this one is complicated. So first, everyone has heard of serotonin in the context of antidepressants. And many people have heard that antidepressants were sort of stumbled on by accident as a heart medicine without any insight into how they might work. Around this time, there was monkey research that I stumbled on in a book that is never talked about because the implications are uncomfortable for people. So the fact is that animals are very competitive amongst themselves, amongst their own groups. And this is very easy to see in all of the David Attenborough wildlife videos, which I love. And there are so many of them, and I recommend all of them. But nobody else talks about it because in academia, where I spent most of my life, it's sort of taboo to acknowledge that there's conflict in the state of nature, and instead conflict is always blamed on our society. So in the animal world, if you want food or mating opportunity, you have to assert yourself you might get bitten. And so natural selection built a brain that rewards you with the good feeling of serotonin when you compare yourself favorably to others and you say, I got it going on. I can assert myself and get that piece of food or that mating opportunity. Now, sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you're in the weaker position. And if you go for a food or a mating opportunity when the big baboon is there and they bite you, in a state of nature, that could weed you out of the gene pool. So we evolved to have the ability to restrain ourselves as well as to assert ourselves. And we're always making that decision, that choice. But serotonin rewards you with a good feeling when you assert yourself and succeed.
So, serotonin flows when you feel important. So we all have this brain that constantly compares itself to others, even if we wish it didn't. And there might be some people that say, oh, I don't do that, but we all do, just in different ways. Can you talk about why the brain is always comparing and what we can do about it? Yeah,
great. So the brain is always comparing because in the state of nature, if I assert myself and get that food, I'm going to develop more physical strength and therefore more of my offspring will survive. What does it take for offspring to survive? There's two dynamics. One is competition over mating opportunity, and the other is the survivability of the young. And males and females are in different places on that spectrum, but it's a spectrum for both of them. And whatever produced more surviving copies of your genes is the brain that we've inherited. So we've inherited a brain that says, I'm going to feel good if I perceive myself in the position of strength, that I'm strong enough. The simple example is, should I go for that promotion? If I do, I can invest a lot of effort in something that I may not get. But if I don't try, then I'm never going to get a promotion. So this is the modern equivalent of it. But what we can do, reminds me of your 3-year-old daughter going off to preschool. And in the modern world, we're not hungry. We're not being eaten by predators. So the worst feeling we have in the world isn't, I don't feel like the big kahuna every day. And I would love to feel like the big kahuna every day. And I want my little baby to feel like the big kahuna every minute. So we send our kids to schools where they're told that they're special all the time. And that may develop this cultural expectation that serotonin should flow and you should be the big kahuna every minute of every day without having to do everything. And then people often get disappointed when they see the world through that lens. So I think it's very helpful to understand the evolutionary origins of this mechanism so that we don't become bitter.
Right. And something you always talk about throughout your books is realistic expectations, which I love. And that's actually a question I usually ask all my guests that come in and talk about what they're talking about. So I love how you do that.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And when we say realistic expectations, some people may have a bad reaction because they think, well, it's realistic that I should be the big kahuna because other people get to be the big kahuna, so why shouldn't I? But you may have the illusion that other people have it made and have it easy, and that's an illusion. And people don't often challenge that illusion because it's a comfortable one. And frankly, that's what my next book is about. But right now, I'll just tell you the simple example that I would have students come to my office and would say, well, it's no fair. I'm studying so hard and I'm not getting this, whereas other people get it easily. Like this is an illusion. This is a fantasy, and it gets in the way of you actually studying. And so once you believe in that, then you're not going to get the serotonin because you're not going to take the steps.
Right. And there's just so many things we put in our head that's just an illusion. Now, what are some exercises that people can do to turn on serotonin?
Okay, so it's hard, but the simple example I always use is, imagine this is called a thought experiment, like Einstein always had thought experiments. So imagine you go to a restaurant and the maitre d' sits you at a table and you look around and you say, gee, I got the bad table. This is so unfair. Why did he give me the bad table? And what I suggest is imagine that you are seated at some other table And then you'd start to notice that that was the bad table because that had some other disadvantage. And then another table was the bad table for some other reason. So every table has pluses and minuses. Every position that you might find yourself in the world in any moment is going to have pluses and minuses. And if you look for the minuses, that's where your brain is going to go. And then you're going to have negative brain chemistry being triggered. So why not just look at the pluses of the table that you're seated at right now? You know, whether I'm in the middle of things or whether I'm out of the way. Sometimes it's good to be in the middle of things. Sometimes it's good to be out of the way. So why can't I just enjoy the one I'm in every moment instead of feeling resentful and frustrated by the one I'm in each moment?
That's a great point, and that's something that's tough to see when you're in that moment. So we have all these happy chemicals, but you also talk about the importance of understanding the unhappy chemicals because they're just as essential to our survival as the happy ones. Can you give us an overview on that and then talk about the role of cortisol?
Sure. So I use the word unhappy chemicals in general, but I mostly talk about cortisol, which is known as the stress chemical, but we've inherited it from animals, and not just the mammals, but it's amazing that it goes all the way back to invertebrates, a cortisol-like chemical. And it tells us that our survival is threatened. So animals don't intellectualize it. It's just that feeling of like, whoa, if I take another step in that direction, something horrible is going to happen. And so we get this feeling in little drips, but we get it a lot. So little drips are stress. A big surge of it would be like fear or terror or anxiety. Now, another chemical that people often wonder about is adrenaline. And what I explain about adrenaline is, so if I were an animal facing a survival situation, there's a certain need to rev my body up really fast in that moment, and another need to keep my body revved up. Now, the momentary revving up is adrenaline. And sometimes I'm revving up for something bad, like a predator is about to get me. But sometimes I'm revving up for something good, like there's a fabulous treat in front of me as long as I rush and get it. So adrenaline is not a good feeling or a bad feeling. It's just a revving up that we then tinge it with either something good, like I'm about to receive the Nobel Prize, or something bad, like something is about to eat me. So that explains why some people love that revving up. For example, people who love sort of danger sports, and other people hate that revving up, like me. Like I listened to my mother screaming so much when I was young that if I hear any opera, like I just get it, it starts my adrenaline. So the bottom line is the cortisol is what tells you I'm a goner. This is awful. So let's say I'm a little kid and I draw a picture and I'm like, look at my picture. I'm expecting a positive response. And instead of getting a positive response, I get a negative response. Now, that's not the same as a tiger eating me consciously, but disappointment is the same chemical, because for that child, their social bond is their survival, because a child cannot meet their own needs. And a human child starts understanding like, whoa, I have needs and I can't meet them. I'm completely dependent. And so that's how that whole dynamic gets started.
And I'm glad you're talking about the child thing. So that brings me now to my next question, because in your book, you talk about one of the reasons why it's so difficult to build new habits or make changes as an adult is because so much of who we are and how we're wired was built in our youth. And this is where you get into myelination. Can you talk about how our brain wires itself starting from when we're born?
Sure. So we're all born with billions of neurons, but very few connections between them. And the connections build each time a happy or unhappy chemical is released. So that's your brain's way of saying this is important, either something that helps you survive or hurts your survival, and therefore you need to know it to avoid it. So we gradually build connections, and that's just wiring up neurons into networks one little step at a time without consciously intending to. Now, when you're under age 8, your brain releases a lot of a substance called myelin, which you could think of, it's like paving on your neural pathways. So all those little connections and all those pathways you activate when you're young, they get paved with myelin, and they are so efficient that you use them without thinking. Your electricity effortlessly flows, and you're not consciously deciding. And to make it all like more powerful, a lot of your neurons die. They get pruned. Is a nicer word. Dying sounds bad, right? They dissolve. And so some build up big and strong, and others are going by the wayside. And that's why each of us gets wired by our unique individual life experience. And when I say wired, it's not the words you use when you intellectualize about your beliefs, but it's the pathways to your neurochemicals that either tell you this is going to be good or this is going to be bad. Now, that myelin that you have a lot of before age 8, then it plateaus, and then you get another spurt of it during puberty. And the reason for that is in the state of nature, as soon as you were in puberty, like you'd start having babies. And so you really needed to meet your own survival needs by then, because then you needed to meet somebody else's needs. So we evolved this brain that avoids inbreeding by moving to another location during puberty. And that, once you have to like get into a new peer group in puberty, you have to learn a lot of new things. So in the state of nature, you had to learn new geography, new survival strategies, new peer group, and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of all those around you. In the human world, you may have moved to a new tribe and learned a new language and had to find a new way home in the dark. So in the end, we wire ourselves and myelinate whatever was going on in that time period, which is why I say that if life feels like high school, it does, because everybody has myelinated their brain networks at that time period.
This is all fascinating stuff, and it's amazing because not only am I able to look back at my childhood years to see how I was wired, but I also have a daughter who's 3, like I mentioned, and so I'm also able to see it in real time with this awareness, so it's super cool. Now, we have a lot of listeners who also have kids as well, and I know your kids are all grown up, so what have you learned as a parent, and what would you share with parents today to help with their kids during these myelination years?
Yes. So with all respect for my kids, who turn out fabulous, but I sorely regret not having understood any of this when they were young, which is what has motivated me so much to keep researching and to keep speaking out, because I spent my whole life avidly reading psychology without discovering any of this until I took my early retirement from academia. So the thing, I call it niceism. So niceism is the belief that if I'm nice, then everybody will be nice to me. The world will be nice to me. If I'm nice to my kids, then my kids will be nice to me. So that's not really the brain we've inherited. So everybody knows maybe, domesticated animals are not always a good model for the brain. So, but in nature, like if an animal gets reward, it doesn't say, oh, I have enough bananas, why don't you have some of my bananas? What the brain learns is, oh, so this is how it works. I just keep taking bananas. So if you raise your child to just, I don't want to say no, I want them to feel good about themselves by just empowering their every whim, it doesn't teach the restraint skills that need to be learned alongside of the assertion skills. So we can learn restraint in a pleasant way when we're young, or we can learn it in an unpleasant way when we're older. So we're lucky if we learn it in a good way.
Great advice. Now, in terms of an action plan, you like to target 45 days of consistently repeating a new behavior. But there's obviously challenges to that for the reasons you mentioned earlier. So what can people expect, and how do you advise people go about creating this new positive habit?
Good question. Okay, what you can expect is that when you repeat a new behavior, that it's going to feel bad, even though in your conscious mind, you're like, oh, yes, I want to do this. Yes, I believe in this. No, I don't want to do that old thing. Like so many people say, well, I ate half the box of cookies before I remembered my goal. How did that happen? So again, to remember that the old behavior is a huge pathway in your brain. The electricity in your brain flows where it goes effortlessly because it takes so much mental effort to conduct your brain into a teeny-weeny, undeveloped new neural pathway when you have such a nice big old one next to it that you're used to using effortlessly. So you have to make your energy available if you want to try something different. So for example, if I'm going to try something hard for me, something I want to do but I hate to do, then let me give myself the energy by doing something fun just before and just after. Now, you may think you don't have time for that, so let's think of it in a really simple way. And let's not use food examples because it's too easy to obsess over that. So let's just say, well, I got an email that hurt my feelings or made me feel threatened, and I have to write a reply to that email. And I feel like it's probably going to make me feel bad, but I need to say something. And so let me do something fun for 3 minutes, something I know I'm going to feel good about. Then I'm going to write the email. Then I'm going to give myself 3 minutes to do something fun after. And it could be like reading a novel. It doesn't have to be stuffing my face with sugar. So the bottom line is if I do that email and then every day for 45 days, I'm going to do that thing that makes me uncomfortable and sandwich it with something fun, then I might still be uncomfortable for a while and I might still not want to do it. But after 45 days, I will have built the expectation like, oh, I could do that, no problem. So it's just a new pathway that my electricity flows into.
And I kind of want to switch gears a little bit now and get into your other book, The Science of Positivity, which is more about stopping negative thought patterns. This is something we all go through. It's like our brain is inclined to go negative. And here's a quote from your book that I love. You say this: "It's natural to look for the bad because the mind doesn't waste energy keeping track of what goes right." So I love that. So can you talk about why our brain goes negative?
So I do have a slideshow since I know we're running out of time. InnerMammalInstitute.org/slideshows. And the first one is 7 reasons why your brain goes negative. I also have a piece on this on Forbes. Bottom line is that our ancestors survived because they avoided immediate survival threats. Now, in the state of nature, something could kill you in a split second. But if you miss out on a meal, that's not going to kill you. So our brain always gives higher priority to the potential threat over the potential reward. Now, the potential threat in the modern world, it's not something that's going to kill you, but because the human brain is good at abstracting, we can reactivate this potential threat, even if it's not going to kill me now, by accumulating evidence, we can figure out how it's going to kill the whole human race in the future. And that's because we're aware of our own mortality and we're struggling to go on and to feel okay about our present, knowing that our future is effectively doomed, excuse me for saying. And so how can I still feel good about that and get back to positive feelings when my future-oriented brain keeps bunking into the unpleasant thoughts about the future?
Fascinating stuff, and there's more on this in your book, The Science of Positivity, so go check that out. Now, we're almost out of time, so where can people find you? InnerMammalInstitute.org. I have lots and lots of resources, including you can opt in for a 5-day Happy Chemical Jumpstart. You can watch a video. But I really do think this is a fabulous podcast that summarizes everything that people
who want their friends and neighbors to understand this. Many people tell me, oh, this has totally changed the way I think, and I keep bringing it up and I keep wanting to tell everybody else, because then when people don't understand it, you feel like they got to understand this. So this is a good introduction, but I also have infographics, slideshows, and all of the books.
Right, and I feel like you're actually providing us with kind of like a manual of how our brain works, which is super cool.
Yes, it is. And alas, it's nothing like what all of the other academic brain people are saying.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be one of my questions. What is the typical mainstream conventional wisdom surrounding this topic? Mostly
it's not talked about. So what happens is many individual isolated chunks of information, which are, no one connects the dots, because if you connect the dots, they challenge the paradigmatic view in academia, which is that nature is all good and everything bad is caused by our society. And it's also this idea that it's not your fault. Like everybody wants to hear, oh, it's not your fault that you have this problem. It's the system's fault. And maybe individual practitioners get a benefit from taking that approach, but it's not helping anybody have a solid understanding of their own operating system.
Very interesting. So Dr. Breuning, great stuff. Again, the website is innermammalinstitute.org. Her 2 books, Habits of a Happy Brain and The Science of Positivity, are amazing. So go check it out. Dr. Breuning, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks again for having me.
All right, there it is. I hope you all got a lot out of this interview. It's all about finding what works for you. So hopefully there was something here for you to think about or put into practice. Everything we talked about is in the show notes, so you can check that out at anchorsofhealth.com/7. That's it for me. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.